Good morning. Oops, ladies and gentlemen, that was a bit loud. Everybody's awake now. Thank you for being here in this session on decarbonization pathways. We have a very distinguished panel with Maria van der Hoeven, Elena Verdolini, Kirsten Van Lop, and Arthur Metzger. The session is quite short, like most of the session in this event, so I won't go through a long presentation of each of them. We will hear first from Maria van der Hoeven, Vice Chair of the high-level panel on the European Decarbonization Pathway Initiative. The main elements of the report, and as the report was published late 2018, but since then many other reports actually are looking at pathways for decarbonization. She will also situate these conclusions in the current context. Maria, if you can introduce us with the main elements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Maria van der Hoeven, and I'm, as mentioned before, the Vice Chair of this high-level platform on decarbonization pathways. And I'm not going to present the whole report to you. I think that would be a little bit too much, but in 10 minutes. But the high-level panel consisted of a number of participants. We were 9, and the interesting was that we came from all different domains. So from industry, from the world of finance, scientists, politics, etc., etc. And that made it quite interesting because from the very beginning it was clear that we had different views. Well, what I'm going to talk about the energy chapter. And why about the energy chapter? Because, well, if you look at what is happening in the energy, 75% is of direct greenhouse gas emissions in the EU come from energy. So that's why I chose this chapter. But of course there are many other chapters, and for instance Elena is going to talk about that as well. What we needed to do was to support the EU strategy, the EU 2050 strategy, a clean planet for all. And that means also that we have to change the way in which we produce and consume energy as the largest greenhouse gas emitting sector. We wanted to highlight the research and innovation actions and policies for the decarbonization of Europe's society and economy. And we did that by really, well, putting forward that report. After that, we had, of course, to see to it that the report was disseminated and that many people were engaged in what can we do with it? How can we get from vision to action, as is also the title of this of today. And that's why there was another organization put up. It was called DEEDS, to support the high-level panel, and the aim was to translate a number of the high-level recommendations to concrete actions for the short term. And to be very honest, you know, this is what we are still doing because it's that part of the work is not finalized at the moment, and that's why this workshop is so very important. I think we have to realize that the EU energy supply is in the middle of the transformation process, and that's a dynamic process. We had already 30% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from energy industries since 1990. And we have another success story, and that's the rapid expansion of renewables from 15% in 2005 to 13.5% in 2017, 33.5% in 2017. But we know that this comes with manifold challenges and opportunities, like massive grid requirements, storage and flexibility. And a further acceleration of emission reductions is needed to achieve a real decarbonization. And that requires that the energy supply and consumption sector needs to undergo a fundamental transformation. It's not only about production and supply, it's also about consumption. And we have to do this in a systems approach, cross-border. And an example of that is, for instance, a northwestern European electricity market. But there is something else that is missing, because today more than 2/3 of the final energy used is non-electric. So what are we going to do about that? Of course we have to enhance electrification coming from renewables. But there are also some other key research and innovation missions for the next decades. For instance, and that goes with other parts of the energy supply sector, bring technologies for emission-neutral molecules to market readiness. Biofuels with CCS, hydrogen, other synthetic fuels. And at the same time, I would like to emphasize that keep an open eye for new opportunities. We have to develop energy storage and conversion technologies at all time scales. Batteries, heat storage, power to X, hydrogen for storage. We have to improve intelligent networks. We have to improve everything that goes with digital and infrastructure for electricity, heat, and gases. And I think we need something else, and that's a dedicated industry cooperation policy support needed to develop new technologies and bridge this valley of death until full competitiveness is reached. And the last and not least is the role of investors and financial institutions. It's crucial. So innovative tendering and better access to higher venture capital and the role of business angels should be not forgotten. But the success of the zero carbon transformation relies also on the development of something else. Credible policies, coupled with well-designed and well-functioning markets. And that means that we need to develop market designs that facilitate renewables integration and incentivize demand flexibility to achieve fast power sector decarbonization. And that means a lot of research and innovation on both policy instruments and market design. And we have to see to it that our policies are robust against negative interactions with other policies on EU, national and regional level. For instance, the weakening of the ETS price signal due to national decarbonization policies. My next point is the need to have increased efficiency and high electrification of all end users. They are key. Sounds logic. But barriers in increasing efficiency are still to overcome. And we all know the split incentives in residential building. And something we have to mention as well is synfuels. They are an important backstop option. But due to high conversion efficiency losses, their use should be reserved for the hard cases, aviation, parts of the heavy-duty transport, some industry processes. And in many cases of heat provision, both residential and industrial, increased efficiency in combination with heat pumps, direct electrification is a competitive option. And let's not forget something. The potential technological solutions already exist at lab scale. Many already do, or at pilot scale. But they are not yet at a required scale to really have an impact and an influence as we would like to see it. And of course, there's a new paradigm. A new paradigm is holistic system thinking, based on a full understanding of the co-benefits and externalities of new technologies, new system configurations. I think we have to realize the full potential of integrating the energy system and linking the development of low-carbon power markets to low-carbon liquid and gas markets in transportation, low and high-temperature heat. And there we need market coupling. I'm not going to talk long about digitalization, about the Internet of Energy, but I think it's absolutely crucial to make everything work. We need to employ more digital solutions and do it in such a way that it is because it's an enabler for many of our climate solutions, for many of our electricity solutions. And I think we need new business models to enable prosumer-based and decentral coordination. And they are being developed also by utilities. So let's not shut our eyes and say we only want this one. We need a whole spectrum, but we have to bring it together. I know that my time is running out, so I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to just say one thing more. You know, it doesn't work? They see it. Okay.
Yes.
And that's the last slide, because I've been talking, you can see it, I've been talking about a number of things. And if you really want to have this is a possible R&I roadmap towards a decarbonized energy supply sector. And in my view, you need a dialogue with relevant stakeholders, as we are doing today. You need creating a knowledge base of relevant research projects on decarbonization pathways and do it in a form of open innovation or open collaboration. Somebody else is going to talk about that. And you need a co-creation of knowledge and policies with representation of industry, science, policy, and civil society. And let's not forget about one thing. Why are we doing this? We are doing this because we want to find solutions for the climate problem that's at this moment facing the world. Not only Europe, but the world. So it means that we have to invest more in an international collaboration to make European leadership in this respect more visible than it has been before. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I would like to hand over to Elena.
Yeah, but I will do just a brief introduction of Elena. And I rushed so much at the beginning to give you the floor that I forgot to introduce myself, so you may think who is that. I'm just your moderator today. I happen to work in the DG Research and Innovation in the Climate and Planetary Boundaries unit, and my name is Philippe Tulkens. And thank you for this perspective from the energy side. Of course, energy is targeted first, but the high-level panel looked at all the options across the sectors, and to decarbonize, we'll have to address sectors that so far have not been targeted so much. And Elena Verdolini, you're a researcher, senior researcher. You work intensively on that report, behind the scenes somewhat, but here you have the opportunity to say what the other chapters have to say in very brief. I know we have very little time, and I strongly recommend you to download the report, have a look. It's organized by chapters, and you can find in the online the areas you're most interested in particular the part on integrating the different components, which is one of the biggest challenge. Please, Elena.
So hi, I'm very pleased to be here today, sharing a little bit of insights from my experience of working with the panel. I was part of the DITS project, which was an H2020 project that was called for in order to support the panel in putting together the recommendations, and it was a true honor to work with them, because we were there while they were scratching their heads and putting together all these R&I recommendations. I just want to convey a brief message, initial message, which is the following. This is a final slide, which you cannot read, so you're not expected to read, that summarizes all the recommendations, the R&I recommendations in the panel. And the reason why I'm pulling up these slides, which is not very visible, is to convey an idea of complexity. This panel is an encompassing collection of R&I recommendations in sectors, the first one of which is energy, which is very crucial, but which also comprehend industry, agriculture, but not necessarily only sectors, also aspects of life, cities, social innovation and behavior, and international implications of decarbonization. Putting together this report was challenging because the topic is extremely, extremely complex. And I think that the value of the report itself lies in the fact that you have not only sector-specific recommendation for research and innovation in all these sectors, but also, and crucially, it identifies cross-cutting themes and cross-cutting investments which are necessary to support systemic change. So let me give you an example. In addition to what Maria was telling you about the energy system, also in the industry chapter, the panel identified a series of short-term, medium-term, and long-term recommendations. Broadly speaking, in the short term, they suggested that we should increase our ability to be energy efficient. We know that there is an energy efficiency gap. We have certain technologies that somehow do not get necessarily used in practice. So there are practical barriers to bring these technologies not only to the market, but also to consumers in our houses, in our transport choices. In the medium term, as Maria mentioned, the electrification of industrial processes is key, because if we electrify industry, we can reap off the benefit of having invested in decarbonization in the energy sector in the first place. Yet, however, unfortunately, electricity cannot solve all our industrial problems. But for instance, in the long term, what we will need to invest in is embedding all industrial processes in what the report calls the semicircular economy. So trying to close all the loops of products and wealth production, and to ensure that we do not waste, but also we develop zero carbon technologies. So this is an additional example, and similar examples in the report you can find for all the other sectors that I mentioned, including transportation and cities more in general. Now, what this report effectively does, it puts forward the sector-specific solution, but also it recognizes that our actions cannot be piecemeal. We need a systemic approach to put in this R&I sector-specific recommendations into effect and into practice. And so the report suggests that Europe should and must innovate itself out of this problem. okay, the report identifies several aspects in which Europe is very well positioned with respect to other countries in the world to sort of set an example on how to go about addressing this challenge. Importantly, I think the report recognizes that this challenge is not only not an easy one, but it also will come at transitional cost. So there are going to be costs, and the problem is we need to find ways to manage this cost. We're going to have sectors that will need to be shut down or effectively reduced to a great extent. We're going to have workforce that is going to have to be retired because not in a situation or in a position to be retrained in a different way of living. And this cost will be there, but we have the opportunity and also the responsibility of addressing these costs in such a way as to minimize them to the extent possible. So what I think is also very valuable about this report specifically is the fact that not only it tells you what we should do, sector-wise and systemically, but it also ends with a very nice chapter that provides an idea on how to effectively try to put this into practice. And I think in my experience working in the research world, this is actually an extremely important value added. When either researchers or politicians come together, they talk about very good and very interesting things, but then effectively people are left at a loss because they don't know how to necessarily implement this in their everyday life. So I think that the contribution of this report is also to put forward the idea of generating what they call transition super labs, right, which is represented in this figure. And the point is to try and put this sector-specific and cross-sectoral R&I recommendation into practice, starting from a very small scale, region, city, a specific geographical area where we can try to experiment in real life how we can bring together these solutions. And I think that the value of this suggestion is actually has been demonstrated ever since the report came out, right? Because there are a lot of movements that are trying to actually effectively put this into practice. And I think that the next speaker, the representative of Climate Kick, is actually the perfect person to tell us a little bit about how this idea of transition super labs can be effectively promoted into practice.
Thank you very much. And you did the transition already. We are very fortunate because Kirsten Dunlop, CEO of Climate Kick, flew from New York, from the summit, back to be with us. She made it on time, and she's at the heart of the knowledge triangle, and she can expand on how to put these pathways in practice and the difficulties and the opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Living with the uncomfortable self-questioning paradox of flying around the world to solve for climate change. So let me explain a little bit about who is Climate Kick and where am I speaking from in picking up immediately on this question of how does one put what is in this report into practice. And I'm going to link that to the Climate Summit because, in fact, if there's one thing that I personally take out of what it's like to be in New York for 52 hours listening to what people are doing and what they're saying, the tenor of a shift from climate change to climate emergency is present and consolidated and concrete and omnipresent. The problem is very significantly then in the gap with what is explained and what are the clear, concrete commitments, not just in terms of roadmaps and kind of targets, but in questions of how, of practical action and collaboration. And that is palpably missing. And there's an interesting kind of mounting tension in the conversations across the last 48 hours, very much around that. So EIT Climate Kick is a member of the European Institute of Innovation and Technology family. We were founded as part of the very first wave of knowledge innovation communities, that's the KIC, so at the end of 2009, beginning of 2010. So we have 9 years of experience of what it means to take European Commission funding and dedicate that to the problem of climate change and climate action. And we have learned a number of things about that, many of which lead to a position on what needs to happen for the next 10 years that is very much about welcoming a report that frames and legitimizes and creates an imperative for a much more holistic, systemic set of responses and investments when it comes to research, innovation, policy, and practice across the European landscape. We have been working on entrepreneurship, on education, on industry transformation. We are responsible for a significant proliferation of startups and of industry projects across the European landscape, and in fact into Africa and South America and into Far East Asia. But one sees a pattern around the fact that the way in which the mechanisms we have in place currently promote innovative responses tend to produce technology substitution solutions, tend to produce single-point solutions, tend to accentuate and reinforce action in sectors and silos. And there is a real need here to find operational ways of working against that and of creating a different frame of action. So we welcome very much the report of the high-level panel on decarbonisation, particularly because the notion of transition superlabs is something that frames very well the culmination of our efforts to reflect upon our own 8, 9, 10 years of history and a decision to pivot our strategy and the way in which we use innovation and deploy and support innovation within Europe and beyond Europe. And that has been something that we've chosen to call deep demonstrations, but they are effectively exactly the same thing. In other words, they are a deployment of innovation not as a factory for bright, shiny possibilities that float around in the capital markets looking for somebody to pick them up and accelerate them to scale, but the use of innovation as a mechanism, a deliberate, systematically designed and deployed mechanism for accelerating learning about how to achieve integrated transformation, and most importantly, about accelerating the generation of options, so that we don't face binary choices, it's this or it's that. It's austerity measures, such as the cities worried about messages where they're essentially having to say, I'm going to take away your cars, I'm going to stop the pleasure of a steak every Friday night, I'm going to start to shut and close the streets. And they have a different discourse to offer. I'm giving you clean air, greener cities, less diabetes, reconnection to communities, a different relationship with ownership, with participation, of redistribution of wealth, and so on. So these are the deep demonstrations that we are running are across 8 areas. They are addressing massive systemic change. Each of them is anchored, and we have very much picked up on the recommendations and thoughts across this extended piece of work. Each of them is anchored by a challenge owner or a problem owner, depending on how you see yourself, meaning a city government, a regional government, a national government in one particular case, or an industry player at the level of its board of directors. And they are putting in practice and in place with those challenge owners a portfolio of options, so a portfolio of innovation initiatives designed to intervene at every single point of possible intervention where innovation could make a difference. Technology substitution for sure, but policy innovation, citizen engagement, the combinations of what might we get if we solve for water and waste and mobility together, when we start to look for integrated solutions, when we begin to think about securitizing the forward future value of, for example, mobility that frees up car parks, or that changes the land value of homes that are currently on busy roads. Securitize the future value of a green city in which mobility is purely electric and organized in much more effective grid mechanisms. And you begin to release a capital stream that starts to incentivize downstream solutions immediately into the ways in which those spaces can be used, and so on. So what these do is put in place multiple solutions in a set of innovation positions where every single position is testing at least 4 or 5 alternatives, so that we are rapidly accelerating our possibility to understand what combination of interventions might have an effect. And through that whole mechanism, as you see here, one of the critical elements there is the constant learning loop back with stakeholders involved at every point. So threaded right throughout these initiatives is a practice of sense-making, continually engaging those who are making, who are choosing, who are learning, who are observing, with those who have decision-making responsibilities to extract the kind of feedback loops and intelligence on what do I do with this? Where is there a small clause in an existing piece of legislation created 100 years ago or 50 years ago that no longer enables us to scale up a solution around energy, mobility, or food practices. These deep demonstrations are in areas around cities. There are 15 cities in Europe, anchoring portfolios for each of them, and these are big cities, big and medium size. There is one country within the European landscape focused on circularity. There are 3 major regions focused on industrial transformation in the Basque region, Silesia in Poland, and in the Clyde in Scotland. There are 3 major regions focused on resilience. There is a major private company focused on food systems transformation. It's the 6th biggest food company in the world. There is, what else do I have? There's ports. So looking at the biggest Mediterranean shipping concentration and the transfer of goods into the Mediterranean, into the port environment, and then overland. So how do we innovate the entire system? Within that, I'm going to pick up on a couple of comments that were made earlier. There is a huge emphasis in the work we are doing, which is our own reflection, because we have not been doing this, on how does one effectively engage the social and behavioral tipping points for change. And this is going from an initiative with museums all over the world to create museums of the future that open up the trusted institutional environments of museums to help people understand and make better sense of what is at stake and what does emergency and response mean to that. Deep listening practice with something like the Mondragon Valley in the Basque area. The Planet Super League, taking the Super League concept and turning it up into something where every single major sporting event becomes an active contributor to carbon sinks, and so on, using mechanisms of peer-to-peer, of arts and science and culture embedded into the heart of pure economic and social redesign. And I'm going to finish up with just a couple of reflections on where this particular report takes us in terms of Europe's prospects and Europe's vision around decarbonisation. And to decarbonisation, I would add climate adaptation and resilience, because they are deeply linked. One is around the question of business model transformation, which is at the very heart of this. This is not a policy project. These are not recommendations for policymakers to think about how and why Europe may change some of the frameworks. This is about an invitation for industry initiatives that are already well underway to renew business models and to adapt business models to a changed set of climate conditions and to expectations of the market becoming more and more concerned about climate, to begin to come together and co-design across entire value chains. So it is possible to think about multiple cash flows and multiple dimensional business models. And that leads us quickly towards industry model transformation and economic and social model transformation. For that, we're going to need to think about different KPIs, different incentives, different ways of understanding what value is. And perhaps we can say something more about that at the end. The last reflection I would say is this report invites Europe to reflect on its role globally. And if I think and loop that back to where I have just come from, the opportunity for Europe to exercise leadership of a particular order now is very present, very real, urgent, and one that is distinctive. It gives us opportunities around institutionalizing the power of design right from the concept of, for example, what mobility is and what it might need to be, what cities are and the value and the role they play, how we understand competitiveness versus collaborativeness, and the principles of open collaborative redesign of prosperity rather than necessarily growth and competitiveness as being the core discourse that drives development. And I think that is the ways in which we can think about governance, design, a shift from competitiveness to collaboration, just as we do a shift from theory to practice with something like these demonstrations and super labs.
Thank you very much for this brilliant structured presentation. We heard about super labs, we heard about deep demonstrators, you may have heard about the mission. All these words, are they covering the same reality or different? This I will leave to the question time that will come after. But before getting there, I would like to introduce you Arthur Rungo-Metzger. He's Director for Climate Strategy, Governance and Emissions from non-trading sectors in DG Klima. Extremely experienced climate negotiator as well. And actually the Commission launched its communication Clean Planet for All on the same day as the report from this high-level panel came out. The communication itself explores different pathways towards decarbonization, and the debate is going on. And perhaps, Arthur, that's where you could give your views from the policy perspective and how it will help the process. Yes.
Yes. And I think the first thing I need to do is to thank the high-level panel, because without your report, our report would not have been possible. And it is, I think, the first example where the report of the scientific advice comes out on the same day when the policy has picked up on the recommendations and tries to turn them into a policy proposal for all the member states, for the regions, for the cities in Europe. I think that's probably the fastest I've ever seen. The same day we came out. And that was only possible because you allowed us to work together with you over the 2 years you were looking at the report, developing the different ideas. So we had a constant sneak preview and we could steal your ideas. And I think that is what you will see in the Clean Planet for All. And we are at this stage at the moment where Europe is embracing the vision for the year 2050 to become the first climate neutral continent, as Mrs. von der Leyen puts it. So I think we are at a very exciting time where we move what looks like theory on paper, both papers, your report from the panel, but even our policy proposal, into practice. And that is a challenging time. So this debate here is very, very timely. What are we going to do next in order to ramp up climate policy implementation, putting it into the real world in the coming years? And the other good thing is that, yes, we have a huge budget at the moment on the table, the next MFF, the next research innovation program, and we can shape it in the coming weeks and months. And we can really put it to use to achieve that huge objective. And I don't have to go into any of what you have been saying on the energy sector, the industry sector, because it's all reflected in our policy proposal. But what we need to think of is how do we make it reality? And the super labs is one of the things we definitely will have to do. Because what is clear from the report and also from our policy proposal is there has to be systemic change. So it's not a change in power company X or power company Y, but is to look at how do you link up the different elements of the system. And one area that was not mentioned is, for instance, mobility, where I think we are set up in terms of really pushing this in the coming 10 years to change the kind of the model, or start to change the model that we have right now, starting with the technologies, but at the same time thinking of what are the other things that need to change. And that's the demand side, as Ingrid, you were saying very clearly. And I think also, Kirsten, you were talking to that, to say, okay, how at the same time can we change the demand side? And that is really the big task. So that also requires that we use the money that we have at our disposal in a different manner, and that we look at it in a very complementary way to what regulation will have to do in the coming years. Because it's not only about, okay, we set a new target now saying let's explore going to 50% or 55% reduction by 2030. The reality is, how do you put it in practice? And that is also what in the end counts when we get to New York, when we get to Beijing, when we get to Washington, when we get to Brasilia, because we need to show that it can be done. And it can be done in a way that is acceptable to our societies, that's acceptable to the regions in Europe, that's acceptable to the cities. And you have all been speaking to this, that this is not just about technologies and modernize the world in that way, but it's also a modernization in terms of the society, where we have to take everybody along with us. But I'm optimistic, I must say. I hear a lot of things where people say here, can we really get to this? I think people are ready for it, for this change, many of them. And we need to get over that threshold in order to say the critical mass we need to reach. And I think that's the big task in the coming 10 years. And that's where the super labs will play an important role. And you mentioned a number of cities you are working with. You mentioned a number of regions you are working with. a single member state you are working with. The real task is like a camembert, put it on a hot plate and then make it sure that it moves as fast as possibly laterally to everywhere else. And there's an idea in the program of the Commission, which is the European Climate Pact. And that is something we should really try to establish in order to multiply what kind of you find, Kirsten, in your super labs you are running, the ideas that have come out of the high-level report, and make sure that cities, that regions start learning from each other, and they learn fast. Wherever I go, I find a good example, but I always find it only once. And I think that is something that we really need to change in the coming 10 years. And we need to put our research innovation money in the proper way in order to allow for that collective learning that is required in Europe to make the systemic change that we need to see starting in the coming 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Now I would like to turn to you, exactly to expand on that, on how to put it in practice and what should be the priorities in the research and innovation program Horizon Europe. This is the whole theme of this event. So I wish to open the floor to question, preferably, not long presentation. And if this works, I'll test it. Hello, does it work? You hear me? So I can just throw the box to whoever wants to receive it. Okay, this is not that new, but it's still innovative. So, ready to catch?
Good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning. My name is Laurent Zibel. I work for Industry All, a European trade union, and I will have a very trade union message here, because I just would like to come up to the last intervention regarding the social acceptability of the changes ahead. And my question and also statement would be, probably one of the big issues we are confronted with is the fragmentation of our societies, the fact that people are pitted against each other, and specifically the rich against the poor, the urban against the rural, and so on. It's very possible that what history also teaches us is that the way forward is to remove the sources of stress at society level, which are inequalities and precariousness, and for which, well, some tools have already been experimented in the past, such as social policy, collective bargaining, and more generally, workers' rights. So, I mean, I'm sorry to be so conventional in a way in my discourse, but I'm also very convinced that if we want to achieve the level of unity that we need in our societies for these massive changes to take place, we need to give us the institutional means for this to happen.
Thank you. Keep the box. You'll throw it to a partner. So this is a collaborative exercise. But we'll first get one reply, or who would like to intervene in this question? Kirsten? Yes?
I'm happy to reply. I understand maybe Arthur is also asked to, but let me just, my two reflections would be climate change effects will accentuate the fragmentation. They risk to accentuate the problems exactly of inequality and precariousness. So we are working against the grain. My one kind of counter-argument would be the innovations, to the extent that we already see possibility and hope, that look like they may be the most effective set of combinations to transform, to modernize in the ways in which we are describing and this report calls for, are innovations that go very much in the direction of a reintegration of participation. We have an initiative, for example, with Dark Matter Labs called Social, it's on smart commons. It's on the ways in which you can use some of the technologies that are there, but also the regulatory innovations to think about and create distributed participation and ownership in a number of things that were previously never democratized to the extent that they now both can be and need to be. So it may be that we can design for both, accepting or understanding that the context of climate change, if anything, puts even more at risk the things you are naming as being concerns.
Thank you, Kirsten.
Yeah,
Maria is a former minister. She knows about these aspects very
just
well.
a very, very short comment. And it's not for nothing that in our report a whole chapter was dedicated to this kind of issues, because policymakers should really understand there will be winners and losers. And the point is how to see to it that the losers are going to be turned into winners as well. And if you don't clarify that at the very beginning, well, you're only talking about new jobs, new opportunities, etc. But let's make one thing clear. Many people will lose their jobs. So you need to put emphasis on new skills, on new training, on new kinds of education. And that's something that has to be done as well from the beginning. And therefore, you can't just say there will be new opportunities. And I think, I'm sure I would like to underline, we have to involve all stakeholders in this kind of dialogue, because otherwise you will miss something.
Thank you. Please, could you throw the box to him? Thank you.
I hope it works. Yeah, thank you. My name is Thomas Jackel from the Austrian Ministry for the Environment, and the aspect I would like to focus on is new business models, which are really at the center of the discussion, because I think it's the only way to implement resource efficiency throughout the whole value chain. And this is an aspect we have to get right before we talk about alternative resources, be they energy or raw materials. One possibility is that these new business models are service-oriented business models. For instance, that even the chemicals producer is paid per cleaned surface area or by covered pieces. If this service-oriented thinking is implemented throughout the whole supply chain, we make resource efficiency an economically driven goal. And this is what it should be. And my question would be, what can policy do? Because you rightly said that is something which is up to now offered to industry. Come on, do this, take it. But I think it's not implemented to the degree necessary. And we now, in Austria, together with UNIDIO, are really struggling also since decades to make this an economically driven goal, resource efficiency and service oriented. But what can policy do to foster these elements?
So I guess the question is addressed to you, Arthur.
Yes. It is a critical question in terms of how do you move from where we are today to tomorrow, knowing very well that even the transition itself is going to pose certain challenges, not only social challenges, but also challenges in terms of the economics behind that. And I think that is something we will have to analyze. And I'm thank Kirsten very much about talking about whole value chains. So we need to think of, okay, what does it mean to the entire value chain, and where are the things where the business model cannot develop? And where we see it very much at the present point in time is just look at the material flow in the European economy. You will see that, I don't know, 10, 15% of that is being circulated. The rest is going to waste. So how do we set the right incentives to make sure that we increase the amount of circularity so that this becomes a business model? And we are tackling this, for instance, looking at the whole battery issue. Storage was mentioned. It's going to be a key element in the transition in the coming years. But we all know it cannot be done on the basis of just throughput. Kind of you use a battery and then you throw it away and dispose it of. You need to recycle. So we are looking at the present point in time, how can we make sure that this recycling is going to happen? So there's one side in terms of helping on research. How do you do the recycling? Because it's a very limited amount of materials that you need to extract from the batteries. The second thing is, how do you make that a business model so that everybody who wants to throw away a battery is not being kind of put into prison, but somehow incentivized to bring it back to somebody who is going to recycle it. So I think these are the different elements along the value chain, and we have to do that for each and every value chain in order to make sure that we'll have systemic change.
Yeah, covering the value chain and be systemic in the development of solution is something that really progressed very much, I can testify. Please.
Can I just add, I think that there's also another aspect that's crucial. All the business models that are viable and economically viable today rely on certain types of incentives. There are incentives for the use of fossil fuels through subsidies. And this is the same for the social aspect. The consumers, poor consumers are subsidized in the use of electricity, which is fossil fuel based. So I think it's about thinking about the new business models, but also a little bit thinking about the old business models and how to take away the comparative advantage that economically they have. So it needs to go, I think, both ways. And if you don't take away what you've already given them, which you don't see anymore as an handout because it's established, I don't think we're going to be successful in promoting the new ones.
Kirsten, you want to add a word?
I'm just going to build very quickly on both with one other, this is a small thing, but one possible lever coming from a little bit left field. My background is working in financial services and insurance. Risk frameworks, particularly risk frameworks, if you think of the European leadership in solvency and Solvency II, create a downward pressure on an organization to allocate capital to mitigate risk. We have not yet included, on a planetary basis, into our notion of total cost of risk, the strategic risk and systemic risk that climate represents. But if you start to cost that in, it gives you, it should free up 4% at least of net revenue that goes to the generation alternative business models. And then you have that forcing function that is an incentive and a pressure.
Fantastic. Is there another question? Perhaps related to research also, innovation, if there's... Please, I think there's a question here. If you can throw the ball. It will go back to the other side after.
Hello, my name is Emil Lezak. I'm representing ISNAP, which is SME dealing with life cycle assessment decarbonization of industry sector is good. And there are some examples like bus depot in Hamburg, for example. They substitute the buses. Carbon capture storage on the energy plant as well. But my question is, does renewable energy sources cover the demand for the industry? This is the question.
The answer is simple. Today, not.
No, it doesn't.
But there's a...
No, but you want to talk about the potential.
Yeah.
And I think...
about capacity of the cover this gap where the coal energy plant will be closed, nuclear plant will be closed as well. So we will keep just the renewable energy sources, and not all the countries have enough, I think.
Well, I think you're quite right. First of, let's be fair about that. Renewables cover a lot of the solution, but not everything. And that's exactly the reason why I mentioned that it's important to bring technologies for emission-neutral molecules to market readiness. And there are biofuels with CCUS or CCS, there's hydrogen, there are other synthetic fuels. We must not close our eyes for different solutions for the same problem, because if you only think that renewables are the only solution for the problem, I think you are missing a point. We have to bring things together. On the other hand, I think it's important that industry really reads the signs on the walls and realizes that it has to change. If industry wants to stay in business after 2050, they have to change. And I think this is actually what is happening nowadays, although some say it's going too slowly. Okay, but let's not forget, in Europe, industry is coming together and is going to change. I think what was mentioned before, the fact to bring industry and policymakers and scientists together in what you called open collaboration, Kirsten, and what I call open innovation, is of crucial importance for two reasons. First of all, to see to it that industry is going to change, to see to it that new solutions are being spread and not kept to one, because some of the solutions can be used by all. And the second reason is industry, especially industry working at a global scale, needs to work in other jurisdictions as well. And what we are doing in Europe, some say we are going too slowly, some say we are going too fast, but nevertheless, we have a leadership there. And that's different from the situation in China, in Asia, and in Africa, just to mention 2 other continents. I think industry can also be very important to see to whether European leadership and the things that are being developed here in the way of climate adaptation and climate mitigation are really, and business, changing in business models, are really also being spread to other continents. So I think we should not underestimate, first, the power of industry to change, and secondly, the power of industry to make things work. Because at the end of the day, we need it to work.
Thank you. I'll do a... This is a risky one. Oh, it's not too bad.
Hello?
Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to react on what was just said. I think I fully agree that all possible solutions need to work together as much as possible. But to react on what the gentleman said before, that you were mentioning nuclear plants are closing, but in fact they are part of the solution, because they are one massive source of carbon-free emissions. And it's a regret that when this is addressed, usually they are seen more as a problem than as a potential solution. Obviously, it's a technology that has setbacks, but then again, which technology doesn't have any setback? And it's, I find it a regret. It's not really a question that is not addressed here. And in fact, there's a room next door on Euratom research, and they were sort of parked in their own area, and they are not included in the global conversation on decarbonization. And I think it's a bit a regret that they are not always considered, being one of the main sources, along with renewables, obviously, of carbon-free emissions, carbon-free energy. Sorry.
Thank you for this comment. It's more a comment than a question.
May I
And,
comment?
maybe you want to
May I
react.
comment to that?
Please,
If I
it's
may.
a very sensitive topic, you know.
Yeah, can I just say
aspects,
something
and
which
we
I
need
hope
to also to
it's not gonna
factor
be-
in just one element, the fact that EU research and innovation policies on Euratom have a specific scope, and the selection of the energy mix of the member states is their responsibility. It's not the EU. This is a very important thing to remind. I don't want to open a
We
debate.
were saying there are
Okay.
silos.
Can
and
I
this is
can I
typically a
pick it
silo.
up and put it in our context, if possible, if that's okay? I come from a country, Italy, that has had not one but 2 referendums on this issue, and the citizens have chosen to outlaw nuclear electricity production. Okay, so this is where I come from, and I think that your comment is important in our context because it brings back the issue of acceptability. Okay, independently of the potential of any technology that there is on the table, people have the right to choose what's acceptable for them or not. So what I'm trying to say here is that I don't want to talk to the issue of nuclear per se, but I think that I want to highlight the importance of having a transition that takes into consideration also other types of concerns apart from necessarily reducing emissions. People may be worried about their quality of life, health versus non-health, risk versus non-risk. So I think that this is an important thing to keep in mind. Not all the things that are available can be used, and the same thing can be said for negative emission technologies, the same thing can be said for CCS, the same thing can be said for solar radiation management, and these are thorny issues which will need to be addressed. And research can help in providing, I think, economic analysis, technical analysis to support decision-making in that respect.
Thank you. So,
Thank you.
I would like
just want to inform that I don't
please,
work for the nuclear industry. I just
that's all right. Fine.
Just a
You
couple-
can throw other questions. Perhaps going back to the core topic, how to put it in practice and how to accelerate. Because we have reduced, and the EU can be proud of that, its emission, all the targets have been met. Soon we'll take stock of, in 2020, of where we are. But we have to decarbonize much faster in much less time. And this is a huge challenge. So we need to shorten the time scale of the innovation chain, and that's what I would like you to focus your question, if possible.
Well, I won't do that. Not for now.
I tried.
My name is Nick Delmere. I'm involved in, let's say, mobility in a broad sense, so decarbonization is high on my agenda. Kirsten, you mentioned in the beginning something about tension. Whatever tension it is, I can feel that as well. But how are we going to contain that tension? Because before we know, the focus is on the tension and not anymore on the work that is to be done. Look at Brexit, what happens there. There's a lot of tension there, and no progress has been made the last couple of weeks, months even a year. So this tension is a concern to me.
May I say something? I think I completely agree, and I'm a mother of 2 children, and I am living a daily question of oscillation between hope and almost sometimes kind of close to nihilistic despair. So it's a hard job keeping optimism the topmost kind of note in the mix. I think that what is being proposed here in this idea of what we are calling deep demonstrations, the super labs, is a very critical key, because there is something about the wiring of the human brain where seeing helps us believe, feeling, experiencing helps us believe, beginning to create the evidence, the physical manifestation of possibility at a scale that is beyond the single living lab buried in a university campus, that starts to be whole districts, 1 million homes, whole river valleys, whole industrial value chains, well beyond borders. And as Arthur mentioned, the possibility of designing that in such a way that there is participation and therefore rapid learning and the conversion of that learning into something copyable. Or extensible or variable. I think there is a possibility there of managing tension through the energy that comes from making alternatives.
I cannot disagree with that, but the language you're talking here to the people here is not understood by the people in the streets.
Of course. And this is not the language that one uses in the streets. The work we are doing in Silesia is not work that's scripted like this. It's about very particular questions to do with the air they breathe and their willingness to engage in making a manifest, tangible difference.
So we need to translate this in language that people understand, or other people than us understand.
Absolutely.
And if we don't do this together, that's the first start.
I agree.
We will fail.
And maybe it's a language of doing. Because I think one of the challenges here, we are talking about a language of conceiving, but this is a language of doing.
Well,
Maybe Maria can
I would like to add
translation.
something from a more political point of view, because I think you are completely right. And I think it's the task of politicians to be very active in doing that. You have to take people's concerns seriously. For instance, what's happening in France with the Gilets jaunes. You have to take their concerns seriously. Because if you don't do that, well, then you don't find the wavelengths to talk with them. And the moment you find the wavelengths to talk with them, then you can add and answer with your new ideas and what it could mean for them, all the ideas we have been talking here. Because otherwise, it's at that level. So we have to bridge the gap to the people in the street. And I think there's a real opportunity, maybe also for scientists, but definitely for politicians. And people engaged in trade unions. You as well.
So if I may add to that, I think it's also very relevant to the fact that the scientific community needs to contribute to this dialogue. There are certain solutions also in the policy realm that are already available. Let me give you an example. Picking up on the Gilets jaunes, British Columbia implemented a carbon tax that was widely and generally accepted because it was designed in such a way so that people could see at the end of the year some money coming back from the window that was going out the door. So I think that the problem is solutions are there. It's just a matter of getting the people who know about the design together with the people who are leading the political, the political realm, together with the people who implement it in practice and try to find solutions that are doable. And again, I think that the idea of experimenting on the ground, it's important because every region, every country will have its own solutions. Industrial policy is something that is decided at the national level, for instance, and it has very important implications on how far you can go in organizing a given region, a given society, and whatnot. So all these things need to come together, I think, in order to close the gap that you're referring to.
Arthur, you wish to say something from the policy side?
Just a sentence, and that is, when we talk about do not leave anybody behind, it doesn't mean that we are going to wait for the last one, because then we are doomed. So I think we need to move, and I think the practice will show that these are viable things that can be done and where people are going to benefit themselves. I think how often do we see that in terms of innovation, that you have the kind of early adopters, and as you get above a certain threshold, the whole thing becomes running on its own, and you don't have to convince anybody because they see in their face that this is working. Kind of smartphones, I believe, is one of those things. You could say, oh, they are so expensive, why should I do this? But in the end, I think nobody cared. They all bought them.
Indeed. Well, thank you for, I think we have to conclude here. There's a very, very informative debate. I encourage you again to have a look at the report, look at the outline. Don't try to read everything in one shot, because there are so many things in there. It's more, you can digest it better if you read it by small bits. But I would strongly encourage you to look at other chapters than the one you are expert in. Because that's where you will find ideas, suggestions, and that you may not have thought about before. Thank you very much, the panelists, for this discussion, and have a good day.